Now, the situation in the Levant is extremely unstable, topsy-turvy. There are all kinds of forces acting on the situation in Lebanon. The situation of Lebanon cannot be separated from the situation in Syria. Indeed, the countries were separated by colonialism, and the colonial powers, as were and now again are heavily involved in political events in the Lebanon. And the satrapies in the Arabian Gulf, in the Persian Gulf area, are also heavily involved, as indeed is Iran. It's a very, very complicated picture. For those of you who say they support democracy in Lebanon, I just make the point to you that if there was democracy in Lebanon, if the president could be freely elected by popular suffrage, one man, one woman, one vote, then Said Hassan Nasrallah would be the president of Lebanon. But Lebanon has a complicated constitution whereby the president must always be a Christian, this based on a census now 70 years old. And the prime minister must always be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament must always be a Shia Muslim. There are also Druze and other minorities involved in a very complicated, specifically Lebanese constitution. I didn't draw up, I don't even support it. But those who seek to undermine the new cabinet in Lebanon and who do so in the name of democracy are willfully denying the information I have just given you. Dr. Jamal Wakim is a very popular author and academic. He is a well-known figure across the Arab world, and I'm glad he's found the time tonight on the mother of all talk shows to join us. Dr. Jamal, thank you for coming on the show.
Good evening, and this is an honor for me to be with you on the show, and hope it would be fruitful and helpful.
Sharafna, the honor is mine, Doctor. Let's start with Lebanon. There's a new cabinet. It looked quite modern and quite female to me, but the Western journalists say it's a Hezbollah cabinet. Is that true? Describe for us the new government in Lebanon and its prospects, please.
Well, the situation, as you explained in your introduction, it's very complicated in Lebanon. But I'll try to be straight to the point and try to give a background to my answer. First, I don't believe that it's the government of Hezbollah. Of course, Hezbollah, we need to admit the fact that Hezbollah has acquired a lot of influence in the past 2 decades due to circumstances, especially his policies directed towards resisting American influence in the region, and at the same time, his success in fighting back and defending Lebanon against Israel. And Israeli aggressions. I'm 47, and I remember all Israeli aggressions since I was a child. I remember very well, for example, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon that led to thousands of victims among the Lebanese and Palestinians. So Hezbollah have been successful. The Americans wanted to isolate Hezbollah, and they benefited from many factors in Lebanon. Hezbollah tried to deal with Lebanese politics from a distance. So prior to 2005, Hezbollah never participated in any government. It was always in the opposition. And at the same time, there were discussions even within the party back in 1992 whether it was feasible to run for legislative elections. But after 2005, Hezbollah needed to be part of the government in order to ensure that any government that would be formed would give legitimacy to the resistance, to the Lebanese resistance, especially that the state the government and state in the past 4 or 5 decades have failed to defend the Lebanese people against Israeli aggressions. So the Americans knew that very well and knew that the whole the majority of the Lebanese political elite is corrupt, including allies of Hezbollah. But most and foremost, the opponents of Hezbollah, the ones member in the March 14th coalition, who were the allies of the Americans. So at one point, especially after the President Donald Trump took office back in January 2017, after he won the elections, he started to step up his pressures on Lebanon and at the same time on Iran, led by a drive or led by the neocons in his administration, represented now by Mike Pompeo. They tried to isolate Hezbollah on the political level. When they failed, they started to exert pressure on the economic on the economy of Lebanon. Of course, the economy of Lebanon is or suffers from deep structural problems since 1992, as all productive sectors, industrial and agricultural, were marginalized, were destroyed to the favor of the banking sector, which was promoted especially after the war, and to make Lebanon, or to render Lebanon a sort of like the Canary Islands or any other micro-state that depends on the banking sector, or to give a safe haven for money to be laundered, or Western money to be laundered in Lebanon. So they benefited from this, and this led the economy to crisis, especially after the accumulation of debt of $100 billion, which is twice the GDP of Lebanon. And this led to the crisis. Of course, there were calls for a technocrat or specialist government. However, we know very well that we had in Lebanon a sort of experience with technocrats. Fuad Senura, former prime minister and the minister of finance for decades, who was one of the biggest symbols of corruption in Lebanon, was a technocrat, or was presented as a technocrat back in 1992. Same with Hariri, Rafiq Hariri Senior, who was assassinated back in 2005. So the technocrats would represent, of course, those who chose them, or let's say who selected them to office, because they will deal with the status quo, with the political situation. Of course, the names chosen, they are specialists. They are not part of the traditional elite, and they will try to make a change. But I don't believe that they would be that successful unless we restructure the whole economy and we get rid of the political elite that have controlled the politics in Lebanon, the corrupt politics of Lebanon, for the past century, and not only the past 30 years. So this is, in brief, this is my approach to the new government. Of course, I know one or two of them in person. They are nice people. However, I have my reservations on their capacity to lead reforms, especially at a time when the pro-American party in Lebanon is trying to fail them or obstruct their way.
The Western treatment of the demonstrations, which became riots, became real serious conflict, banks being burned and so on, they always seek to imply and sometimes explicitly state that the masses on these demonstrations are against the sectarian nature of the Lebanese state. Even though actually the beneficiaries of the scrapping of sectarian quotas and so on would actually be Hezbollah. Hezbollah, if it wanted to sweep away this sectarian system by force, would actually be doing themselves a favor, but would not be doing Lebanon a favor. Is that fair?
Well, my approach to the sectarian system, I'm anti-sectarian, I'm secular. The sectarian system is the ideological or political organization of a rentier economy controlled by a mercantile elite linked mainly to the West and with, let's say, part of it linked to the Gulf petrodollar. So Hezbollah is not implicated in this game, actually, because the political elite or the political leadership of Hezbollah is not part of the traditional political elite and financial elite in the country. And this is something that we should admit. Regarding the demonstrators, actually, we cannot talk about of one, let's say, group. There are too many groups. First, there are those who, and with different objectives actually. So those who come from a liberal background and who favor private sector, they are against Hezbollah. They are supported by the Lebanese forces, which were themselves part of all governments since 2005 at least. Future Movement, which had formed, which is the party of the former Prime Minister Saad Hariri and his father Rafiq Hariri, and which had led the country to this crisis for the past 3 decades. Of course, the Jumblat faction, which is who is a warlord implicated in massacres back in the 1980s during the Civil War. And of course, there are those who come from a leftist background and who don't aim directly against Hezbollah, but they direct their anger against the banks. These were the ones to attack the banks, by the way, and against the liberal elite that have dominated the country, the mercantile elite. They call for socialist reforms. So there are different objectives, and the street is a mosaic of all these groups right now. So I don't believe that all of them agree on eliminating or changing the sectarian system. For the leftists and part of the liberals, they call for that. But for the Lebanese forces, the Future Movement, the Jumblati faction, and others, for Amal Movement, of course, for the Free Patriotic Movement, and for the Phalange Party, I'm naming opponents and allies of Hezbollah, they all agree on this sectarian formula because it have given them the possibility to access power and to protect their interests, their financial interests, actually. So this is the way I understand it.
Now, let me ask you, I've been involved in Lebanon from the 1970s, so I know something about it myself. But for the audience, isn't it the case that Lebanon cannot be separate? There were isolationist forces in the 70s that wanted to take Lebanon out of the Arab world, as if you could do that like a piece of jigsaw. The fate of Lebanon is inextricably bound with the fate of Syria, the fate of Palestine, the fate of Iraq, isn't it?
Definitely. I fully believe in this. Actually, what's going on in Lebanon is, in an indirect way, an attempt to destabilize the region one more time, especially at a time when the United States have lost most of its influence in Syria. So it's trying to substitute for this loss in achieving gains, political gains in Iraq and in Lebanon. And this explains the American stance regarding the part of the demonstrators, and whether in Lebanon or in Iraq. Well, I believe that this is also part of its grand strategy to have this deal of the century, which aims at liquidating the Palestinian cause and give the Palestinians nothing in return of their involvement in the peace process. But for this to happen, they need to neutralize the opposition in other countries, including Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And this explains the chaos that have been prevailing in these countries for the past 2 decades now. So, yes,
will they
I
win?
fully believe
Will the US succeed or fail in your view?
Well, I don't believe that they will succeed because we've been through worse situation in the past. The Americans were much stronger back in 2003, and the axis opposing them was much weaker. Now, well, back in 2003, Syria and Iran were standing alone against the United States and their allies. Now we have the Russians and the Chinese on the side of Syria, Iran, and the Lebanese resistance. The Lebanese resistance itself is much stronger than it was back in 2003, 4, 5, or 6 during the Israeli aggression against Lebanon. The Palestinian resistance is much stronger. The Americans and their allies are much weaker than they were before. So, and actually, this comes at a time or coincides with the fact that the West in general is declining because there is a shift of the economic hub of the world for the first time since 5 centuries from the Atlantic Ocean back to the Indian Ocean. And this is giving the upper hand to Russia, China, and Iran, the Eurasian bloc, against the Atlantic bloc. And this explains the violent attempts of the United States to try to make a difference, especially in Lebanon. They are trying whatever they can, but I don't believe that they will succeed. They could have succeeded before, but they didn't. Now things have changed dramatically.
Things have changed.
Yeah.
It's a great Bob Dylan song, that, by the way. You need to listen to it. Things have changed. Dr. Jamal, thank you very much indeed
for
joining us.